Hello, cruel world. My name's Dr. 𝗩𝗲𝗄. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. And this video is about whether Britney Spears should be under a conservatorship and also the barriers for her to revoke this. So in my career, I've performed around 50 capacity assessments for the civil courts in the United Kingdom. So capacity, I guess, is the equivalent of being under conservatorship in the States. I have to say, before I saw the documentary Framing Britany Spears, I had just generally assumed that the system was like balanced and fair, and I had assumed that the fans of Britney Spears that were like kicking up this fuss to get her off the conservatorship probably were just doing it based on pure kind of emotion and not on a factual basis. But I have to say that after watching that documentary, it's made me kind of question everything. So this video is an overview of what a conservatorship is, whether Britney Spears should be on one in the first place, and just what's going on in her case, and also details of how you can revoke one. Let me give you a brief summary of the facts. So in 2008, Britney Spears had a very public breakdown that was caused, at least in part, by the paparazzi just constantly hounding her. And her father, Jamie Spears, became the sole conservator. And there was some kind of doubt, again highlighted in the documentary, that this was reasonable given that at least earlier when she was younger, he seemed very concerned about her finances and how much money she was going to make, possibly more than her actual well-being. So somebody's capacity is their ability to make decisions, usually sort of fairly basic day-to-day decisions. And in the UK, it's governed by the Mental Capacity Act 2005. I've actually written a patient information leaflet on behalf of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. So if you want to know more about this topic, I'll be honest with you, it's a little bit dry, but if you do, then you can click on the link below. So it's to do with all kinds of basic day-to-day decisions. One good example would be the ability to decide about what care you want. So I once assessed a man who had paranoid schizophrenia and then also developed prostate cancer, and he didn't want to have all the treatment, which could be quite reasonable because it's invasive treatment, lots of scans, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and it might just be that he'd rather just live comfortably even without having this intervention, even if it meant his life was shorter. And that's fine. If he's got capacity to do that, that's his decision. But he also had some paranoid ideas about doctors wanting to take his blood rather than treat him to try and poison him. So that is different. That means that he might not be able to weigh up the decision sensibly and therefore might not have capacity. There's lots of other areas this decision could affect. So for example, the capacity to manage your finances, I believe, is particularly important in Britney Spears' case, especially considering she was making millions of dollars. There are 4 elements to a capacity test, so you have to be able to do all 4 of these things for any one decision to formally have capacity. And they are to understand the information. So for example, in Britney Spears' case, she would, if it's about her money, she would have to have a vague kind of understanding of how much she earned, how much she had to pay in tax, how much expenses she had in general. Number 2, to retain that information. So that's able to remember this information long enough to make a decision. So for example, somebody with dementia might understand some information, but they might forget it a couple of hours or a day or 2 down the line. Number 3 is to weigh up the information, so to use the information appropriately to make a decision. So for example, if Britney Spears needed to make a decision about getting a new hairstylist, she would have to weigh up the relevant factors, how often she would need the hairstylist, how much the hairstylist charged, what the normal price for a hairstylist is, how much money she's got. So just all the basic relevant factors that you and I use all the time to make very normal day-to-day decisions. And finally, they'd have to be able to communicate that decision. So it's not really that relevant for Britney Spears, but say somebody had a stroke and they couldn't speak, there might be other ways that they can communicate that at any given decision about finances, treatment, etc. So as you can see, this is fairly basic stuff. So for you to not have capacity, to be found non-capacitous, the threshold is quite high. So you have to be severely unwell, really unwell, to not have capacity. So in my experience, from the many assessments that I've done, people who fall into this category either have dementia, as I mentioned before, or a very serious psychosis like schizophrenia, or they might have something like a very serious head injury and are severely disabled. One thing I want to make really clear is that making a bad decision in itself is completely irrelevant to capacity. So just because somebody makes a bad decision doesn't mean they don't have capacity. as long as they understand how they made that decision. So, for example, say Britney Spears just suddenly decided to spend all of her money on ice cream, right? If she actually understood why she made that decision, if she understood roughly how much money she had, how much ice cream costs, and what she was going to do with all this ice cream, then even though it's a really crazy, insensible decision to make, she still would have capacity. And the other thing is that people make bad decisions all the time, like people who smoke, and I'm an ex-smoker, are making a bad decision every time they have a cigarette, or like that time your sister did porn. So a conservatorship in the States is the equivalent of what we have in the UK of a guardianship order. And that means when somebody is found not to have capacity, it's deemed only safe and fair for somebody else to make decisions on their behalf. So Jamie Spears in this case is that somebody else, Britney's father. And in the States, there's two types of conservatorship. There's the conservatorship of the person, which is for day-to-day decisions like what clothes somebody's gonna wear, what they're gonna eat. And there's conservatorship of their estate and their finances, so how to spend their money. And she apparently needs a conservatorship for both. And it's always given on the evidence of a medical report. So somebody like a psychiatrist would have sat down with her and formally assessed her capacity. So how can a conservatorship be cancelled or revoked? There's 4 ways. If the conservator themselves, so in this case Jamie Spears, decides that he doesn't want to do it anymore. If the protected person objects, so Britney Spears, which I believe may be happening, but obviously it takes a while to get through the court process. Number 3, if a third party tries to challenge it, but they have to have a factual or legal basis. So obviously this is, if you've seen the documentary, you'll know that there's a whole movement of Britney Spears fans that are trying to cancel the conservatorship, and which they're allowed to do, but it can't just be because they think it's unfair. That's not a factual or legal basis. They need to have some sort of proof that something has changed. Or number 4, which is kind of similar, is if the courts are aware of neglect or misconduct. So if there's some sort of evidence that Jamie Spears is doing something that's grossly inappropriate or unfair, such as stealing lots of money. So the ultimate question is, what is going on in Britney Spears' case? Well, the first thing that jumps out to me is I cannot understand how it's possible for somebody to not have capacity, so to need a conservatorship for 13 years, and at the same time they're out doing shows, making an album, being a guest on the American equivalent of the X Factor, having a residence in Vegas and touring. To me, it's not compatible. Because to not have capacity, as I said before, you have to be really unwell. You know, I'm talking people with psychotic dementia. Britney Spears may well have had a breakdown, but the two things just, they clash in my mind. I don't see how it's possible. So I should say that I cannot say absolutely definitively whether Britney Spears has capacity or needs a conservatorship. Nobody can unless they are an experienced psychiatrist and Britney Spears is sat right in front of them and they're able to ask her the relevant questions about her understanding of finances, etc. However, in the documentary, there's this solicitor called Adam Streisand who said that he sat down with her, and this is just before the conservatorship was made, and she was absolutely fine in conversation. She was able to relay her thoughts, her ideas, her intentions and wishes, and then he challenged the judge, and apparently the judge said that there was a medical report which suggested that she didn't have capacity and needed a conservatorship, but unusually the judge wouldn't show this report to this solicitor. Now, as I said before, I've done about 50 formal capacity assessments for the civil court in the UK, and I found the patient to not have capacity about a quarter of the time. And I have to say that without question, every single one of those patients that I've assessed was far more disabled than Britney Spears appears to be. You know, as I said before, serious chronic psychosis, for example, hearing voices, etc. And this is something that I think might shock you, of the people that I saw that did have capacity, although this was questioned, which is why they were sent to me for the assessment in the first place, of the 3/4 that I thought did have capacity, I would go as far as to say that every single one of them also was less functioning than Britney Spears reportedly has been, again, going on tour, making albums, doing shows. In the interest of balance, I should say that there was a period in 2019 when Britney Spears went to hospital for about a month, and that was because she was worried and under stress about her father, who she was close to, becoming physically unwell. So there's an argument that she might not have had capacity for that period of time. Personally, I don't buy that argument because, firstly, it was only a month, so it's not that significant compared to 13 years, which is how long she's been under the conservatorship. But also because she went involuntarily. She wasn't committed or sectioned, as we would say in the UK. And to be a voluntary patient, you have to have the capacity to consent to go to hospital, by definition. Otherwise you'd be section committed. So it doesn't make sense to me that people are saying she's got the capacity to decide whether she should go to hospital, but she doesn't have the capacity to manage her own finances. So in my mind, I cannot piece together how she should have been under this conservatorship. It doesn't make sense to me. Okay, so I'm about to give you my professional opinion on whether I think Britney Spears had capacity, which I've already hinted at. Before I say that, I'm just going to say that I'm not particularly a fan of Britney Spears. I hated her music. When it first came out, I was in medical school, I was into my gangster rap and my 90s hip hop, so I had this assumption that all manufactured pop was just rubbish, and I assumed that all pop stars were like attention seeking and probably fake and probably quite shallow. And I have to say, now that I'm a bit older, probably a bit less judgmental, I think maybe I was being a bit harsh. And having watched this documentary, I really pity Britney Spears. I mean, the paparazzi were just constantly hounding her. Especially, I saw this one scene that you'll know what I'm talking about if you've seen the documentary, where she was having like a confrontation at Kevin Federline's house related to the custody of her children. And she was obviously really stressed. And these paparazzi were just constantly following her around, asking her questions that were none of their business. Just really in her face, and I just found the whole thing really uncouth. I found it very sort of unpleasant and voyeuristic, and I found it predatory. They were trying to make money off her distress in a really sort of tasteless, tactless manner. So the first question is, do I think that Britney Spears has capacity? I think she almost certainly has had the capacity to make basic decisions for almost all, if not all, of this 13-year period. So why did the courts find that she didn't? Well, I suppose one possibility is at the time that it was very first made, she didn't have capacity for a short period of time, which is probably reasonable if she had a serious breakdown. But clearly it's changed because of her functioning, as I mentioned all those things before, tours, albums, etc. So why did the courts find that way? I suppose another explanation might be that there was some corruption with the judge or with the psychiatrist or the doctor that carried out the assessment in the first place. I really would like to think that's not the case, but to be perfectly honest, I'm struggling to think of another feasible explanation. So if I'm correct, and if I have the same kind of views as it appears Britney Spears fans do, is that she shouldn't be on this conservatorship and she should speak out, then why hasn't she so far? Well, there's a theory that she's like trapped, physically trapped and in fear of speaking out, but I don't really buy this because it's been 13 years, and during that time she's done adverts, she's gone on tours, so there would have been several occasions or opportunities where she couldn't have spoken out. I suppose she could have felt some way emotionally trapped or threatened for speaking out. So there's a theory in the documentary that she was scared that her kids would be taken away from her if she spoke up against the conservatorship. But this doesn't really make sense to me because, well, if anything, it's the opposite. If she can prove that she has more independence and cognitive function, then that would more likely lead to more access to her children. So possibly she's been given some very bad basic legal advice. I suppose the other possibility is that she has tried to speak out in the past, but she's been shot down by a corrupt system, so corrupt judges or corrupt psychiatrists making the assessment. And again, I'd like to think that's not possible, because I'm not really a conspiracy theory kind of guy, but I don't know, I'm starting to question things. And another possibility, she might have just felt quite comfortable with the arrangement. So I remember assessing a patient for depression a couple of years ago. She was Arabic, from an Arabic background, and she worked, and her pay went directly into her husband's bank account, and her husband gave her spending money. And I was shocked at this at the time, and I thought she was being exploited, and I offered to get help through the police and the social services. But to my surprise, she was fine with it. She was actually quite happy with the arrangement because she thought she was being treated fairly. So it's possible that Britney has been under this conservatorship for so long just because she was just happy with the way her finances were managed and didn't really see any point of changing it. Anyway, I'm coming to the end of the video. I hope that now that I've made a video on Britney Spears, I'm not accused of pop psychology. So just before I go, I would like to welcome you formally to this channel. This is Psych for Sore Minds. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist and I live and work in London. I assess mentally disordered offenders so you don't have to. So I usually assess them in courts or in prisons or in secure psychiatric units, but I also do a whole range of other medico-legal work like capacity assessments that I've talked about in this video. So this channel is like a crossover of true crime and mental illness, and it explores a whole range of issues related to mental illness, some to do with offending, or some like this video have got nothing to do with offending. So I cover a range of topics from discussing individual psychiatric diagnoses to interviewing people who have had experiences of mental illness, including serious stuff like suicide attempts. I dissect famous cases of people who have committed horrific crimes who have a psychiatric diagnosis. Bit of everything. There is something for everybody on this channel. And my USP, I think, is that in some of my videos, I talk in detail about actual real life cases that I've assessed and I've been involved in. Obviously, I anonymise the patient out of respect for their confidentiality. So please check out my other videos. Please consider subscribing. And until next time, stay euthymic and remember, I love you.